Any other questions? Let's move on then to talk about scholasticism. We talked about it a little bit in the last time, the last time period we looked at. But as it moves into the 14th and 15th centuries, and it began to be changed, the scholastics, of course, the early scholastics, Anselm, Peter Abelard, Thomas Aquinas, had largely indicated their belief that that faith itself was reasonable, and that articles of faith could be determined by the reason and not solely by revelation. Well, as scholasticism developed, later scholastics began to question this very fundamental principle to scholasticism. People like John Duns the Scot. Duns was his family name. His nickname was Scotus, so he's often referred to as Duns Scotus as well. Born in Scotland, as you might be able to expect. It was Scotus that is very important here in this transition, because largely scholasticism is moving from Neoplatonism as a philosophical background to Aristotelianism. And Scotus is a part of that. Born in Scotland, he will eventually become a Franciscan, studied in Paris, where he will eventually become a lecturer as well. By the early 1300s, he is teaching in the city of Cologne, in what will become Germany, but ultimately the Catholic Church is not really sure what to do with him because of a lot of the things that he is beginning to teach and write about. Now, I mentioned that a lot of university study had to be done in Latin, but Latin as a language outside of the universities is beginning to break down. Scotus is one of the last ones to really use Latin to any significant extent in trying to reach a larger audience. Although a lot of scholasticism is shaped by Aquinas, Duns Scotus is very critical of Aquinas because he believes that Aquinas is trying to harmonize Aristotle and faith. This was one of the difficulties as Christians became interested in Aristotle, philosophers, Christian theologians. How much of Aristotle do you take on? Because there were a lot of things in Aristotle's philosophy that were incompatible and sometimes contradictory to Christianity. So some people would just kind of adopt wholesale Aristotle or try to Christianize him in such a way that they would overlook these difficulties. Others try to use him sparingly. And then people like Duns Scotus try to reject a lot of what Aristotle taught to begin with. Very important for Duns Scotus's thought and thinking about the universe and human nature was the importance of God's will. Aquinas had focused a lot on God's intellect and believed that knowledge came from God illuminating the intellect, and God kind of actively working on the human mind to reveal things. But Duns Scotus has gotten to the point where he doesn't feel that reason can be used to explain God. There's just something about God that cannot be understood or explained through the reason. And at base, there is an ethical question here as well. Which occurs first? Does God choose what is good? Or does God, through the choosing, make something good? Right? Is it good because it's good, or is it good because God says it is good? And so for Aquinas, God determines the moral value of something, and then wills people, or expresses his will, that he will reward people that act on good things. All right, so God decides what is good and then rewards people that will do that good. Scotus says, no, God has determined that he is going to reward moral action and then determines what is good. And so, to us, again, a lot of these debates seem to be insignificant. But for the time, they are considered to be very important. Ultimately, Scotus believes that God saves people because he has decided he has willed to save people, not because of grace or virtue. God has perfect freedom for Scotus. He has chosen to save those who lead virtuous lives, which binds him in some ways, because he's bound himself to only save those who live virtuous lives, but he has freely chosen to do this, so it is compatible with his free will. And so for Scotus, there's nothing inherently good about virtue or virtuous acts. If there were, this would compel God to reward it. Right? If there was something good in the act itself, God would be forced to reward a good act. But God cannot be compelled. There's nothing that makes God do anything. So God must choose first, and then we can talk about virtue and reward. Scotus is also important for the beginnings of a doctrine. He's not the one who begins it, but begins championing it, the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception of Mary. Essentially, the belief that Mary was born without original sin. The reason this is necessary for a lot of people, and will eventually become a Catholic dogma in the 1800s, is because if she is not born without original sin, how can she stop from passing on? All right, how can original sin not be passed on to Jesus when he is born? So, Mary must have been born without original sin. However, of course, you say, okay, well, how does Mary not get original sin? So her parents must be married the whole way back. But Mary's where it stops. There's no development of this kind of infinite regression of Immaculate Conception the whole way back to Adam and Eve. Not everybody at this point accepted this. Aquinas and others condemned the doctrine and believed that it was compatible with theology. Very important for a lot of the scholastics, as we've mentioned before, is the method of discovering truth. It is a process, and we talked about a little bit of that when we talked about scholasticism the last time around. And so, for Duns Scotus, it is about the presenting of options and then refuting them. But where other scholastics had done exactly the same thing, Scotus begins to say there's a difference in arguments. Some arguments are actually more important than others. So he's kind of prioritizing arguments. And also making the distinction between what's probable and what's more probable. Ultimately deciding, though, that reason has some limitations. Reason can only show the will what is possible. And it cannot entirely explain everything. Which means there are two types of knowledge that an individual has. There is the abstract knowledge, which understands things through reason. You can understand concepts, the relationships of concepts. And then there's just knowledge that is intuitive. Things we just learn or know without necessarily have to reasoning it out. However, just because we know that God has done something doesn't mean we know God. So there's a limit to knowledge as well. And a lot of the scholastics focused on this kind of empirical understanding of God, what can be learned through the reason, through nature, other things like that. But for Duns Scotus, there's something incomplete about this. This doesn't contribute to the knowledge of God. We can know, for example, that God has created the world, but that doesn't really help us know God. We just know what God has done. So when for Scotus it comes to the existence of God, he does fall back on some reasoning, but it's not necessarily entirely about what can be experienced through the senses. Largely, his proof has to do with what we're going to call the causal argument. Given the existence of something that is caused, and something that's contingent, something that happened, a being that happened, it could have been caused by itself. It could have been caused by nothing, or it could have been caused by someone or something else. Right? Those are our options. But, says Scotus, nothing causes nothing to come into existence. So something can't be caused by nothing if it exists. And really, if something is an effect, it cannot cause itself. So while we might think of, it could be caused by itself, it could be caused by nothing, it could be caused by someone or something else, it does not, we immediately say, well, if there's nothing, it cannot cause nothing. So an effect must be caused by something. So this something that has caused our effect itself could be caused or uncaused. And it does not seem reasonable to assume that there is an infinite set of causes where there is no end to things being caused by other things. There must be, at some point, some cause that caused the other things to exist. And you can't just go back in time further and further and further and further and further, and there's just a series of causes. There must have been some sort of origin. So, God must exist, or at least some idea of God, some being like God must exist. Also important for our understanding, or pointing towards the Reformation, I should say, is Scotus' views on justification. Justification refers to the idea of how is a person made right with God. For Scotus, God did not have to forgive us. There's nothing that compels God to forgive human beings. On the other hand, though, we do see divine love in the coming of Jesus, whether we believe that he needed to or not. And so if you believe that God didn't need to save us, that means Jesus didn't need to come, but it's still an example of God's love. Scotus also made a distinction between the ideas of forgiveness and seeking forgiveness. Remember, very important in Catholicism is confession, the practice of confession. But for Scotus, related to justification and forgiveness, confession must mean something. It's not just the expression of saying, well, I sinned. Now, yes, there was a lower level of seeking forgiveness, where someone would be, would essentially say, I'm sorry I got caught. That plus the sacraments, was a lower level of forgiveness, might result in forgiveness, but it was a higher level of forgiveness that Scotus encouraged. Contrition, true sorrow, not just being sorry that you got caught, but truly being sorry for what you've done. But with Scotus, you have this development within theology itself where there's this widening of the gap between faith and reason. It's not the equivalence, the almost equivalency that we see in somebody like Aquinas. Because sometimes, for Duns Scotus, you have to appeal to the church's teaching. And doctrines are made by the church's teaching, not necessarily because of reason. Of course, theology itself is an attempt to limit God. It's a product of human thought for Scotus. And so, you're trying to systematize God and talk about God's attributes when God is beyond description. So theology by itself cannot describe God because God is indescribable. And so God's essence cannot be captured in theology. God is beyond that. The theologian who doesn't realize this then does not let God be God. So if you think you can explain God, then you're not letting God be God. Another important scholastic thinker here toward the end of this period and around the same time is William of Ockham. Essentially, William represents, and scholasticism to some extent represents, Duns Scotus would be here as well, a transition between what is often referred to as the Via Moderna and the Via Antigua, the modern way and the old way, or the ancient way. The ancient way, which would still have been reflected in somebody like Anselm and Aquinas, was the acceptance of reason and faith being united. But with Duns Scotus and others, you see this growing skepticism about the abilities of human reason and what human reason can necessarily determine. You also have this shift that we talked about the last time we were talking about scholasticism between realism. Concepts actually exist, really. There is a realm where a circle actually exists, and all expressions of a circle are based on that. Well, you have this shift from that conception to nominalism. Concepts are simply names, or related to names. And so where Aquinas and Anselm and others believe that faith is reasonable, what is believed by Christians is intelligible, these other scholastics question that, and would eventually shape the universities in Northern Europe, places like Paris, Heidelberg, etc. William, of course, represents one of these. Born in England, he too would become a Franciscan at an early age, would study at Oxford and then under Duns Scotus in Paris. Eventually, William would become a teacher himself and would begin writing in addition to his teaching. But it was his writing that got him in trouble. He writes a rather controversial work which is condemned by the hierarchy, and he's ordered to Avignon, where the papacy is at this time. Not only does the Pope have problems with Occam, there are problems against there are questions about the Franciscans as well. And so the Pope kind of turns against the Franciscans, and Occam and the others have to flee. Seems to be that the major issue was the issue of poverty. The Franciscans, as you might expect, argued that Jesus and his apostles did not have possessions, and so this should be followed by the church, especially the Franciscans. Eventually, William is excommunicated, and he will live out his excommunication for the rest of his life in the court of Emperor Louis of Bavaria. William, of course, represents this shift to nominalism. Platonism, of course, had supported the idea that you need to understand universals in order to understand reality. William rejects that. Real things are known through intuitive knowledge, not through abstraction. We know things because we have encountered them, or that we conceptually grasp them through their names. He also rejected the idea that reason alone could tell us about certain faith doctrines. How do you believe in the immortality of the soul, for example, through reason? There's nothing reasonable necessarily about this. Furthermore, Aquinas may be able to argue, for William, that motion means it was set in motion. And so one of the 5 ways of Aquinas is motion. Things are in motion, so there must be a mover. But William says, how do you know there's just one movement? And reason might suggest that something created emotion, but how do you know it wasn't some things? So reason itself becomes problematic, which, essentially by doing this, he's beginning to question the authority of the Pope, the authority of the Church, which is no wonder, of course, why he would end up in trouble.